Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Notion at Work webcast. I am William Nutt of Nutt Labs. We're an integrated digital strategy firm and Notion consultancy. And I also run the independent website Notion VIP, where I publish tools and insights about all things Notion. You can access that at Notion VIP. So this is the second episode in a little mini series that we're doing on formulas for work. And if you missed the first episode, it was a little bit of an introduction to formulas and particularly functions. So if you haven't worked with formulas previously, you may want to check that one out after this, but definitely stick with us here because I'm going to briefly overview the fundamentals of functions. And then you'll be able to visit that initial one and then explore the recording of this one. So in this second edition, we're going to be exploring the if function. And the if function is among the most versatile and widely used functions in Notion. And it's actually a function of spreadsheet tools like Excel and Google Sheets. And it's commonly used in those tools as well. So your knowledge of the if function will really extend beyond just Notion. It's a good technique to have, an arrow to have in your quiver anywhere. And what it does is the if function allows you to generate a value based on conditions that you specify. And that means that you can automate properties and just kind of streamline your overall workflow a little bit better. So after a brief refresher on functions, I'll explore the fundamentals of the if function in particular, and then we'll build out a few practical examples whose principles can really be widely applied to a variety of different uses. And those examples that we'll be constructing, I've made them available as a free template on Notion Market. So you can access that at market.notion.vip. And as you're practicing with the if function, you can reference those to see exactly how they work. And I'm going to take questions at the end, as I typically do. In Crowdcast, you can use the Ask a Question feature to submit any questions as they emerge during the kind of initial presentation. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find a link to Crowdcast in the description so that you can use that Ask a Question feature. And since it's just me, I'll just ask, as always, that you let me know in the chat if anything's happening in a funky way with the audio or video. I'll check in on that briefly as I'm kind of going through this exercise. Danny is always really helpful for that and engaged. So Danny, obviously, answer any questions that emerge along the way in the chat and offer everyone your Twitter handle and resources. Danny is a really great follow. So with that, I will expand my screen here and we will jump into it. So again, we'll start off with that kind of brief refresher of what functions are. And so functions are used in formula properties, and they're kind of pre-configured actions that you perform on their inputs. And those inputs for functions, they're known as arguments. So each function is going to take a specified number of arguments, and those arguments need to be a certain value type, such as a text string or a number or a date. So Notion offers a variety of different functions for every value type, and you'll find a full list of functions at my Notion formula cheat sheet at notion.vip/formulas. And there you'll see a description of what each function does along with the arguments that it accepts. So then what specifically is the if function? Well, the if function, like I said, it's going to return a value based on conditions that you specify. And to do that, it's going to take three arguments. So the first argument is going to be an expression that evaluates to a Boolean or true or false. And so typically that first argument is going to be a comparison that you make between two or more values, and those values will typically be, at least one of them will be a reference to another property in the database. So let's look at a really basic example of what I mean by an expression that evaluates to true or false. If and typically for this, you'll be using the comparison operators such as less than and greater than. But if we just type 2 is less than 3, for example, that's an expression that's going to evaluate to true or false. It's going to evaluate to true because 2 is indeed less than 3. And so this true in Notion is going to be represented as a checkbox. If we reverse this less than symbol and make it a greater than, this expression is going to evaluate to false, and we can see that we have empty checkboxes. So the first argument of the if function is going to be an expression that evaluates to true or false. But remember, you're typically going to be using other properties within the database as the values. You won't be entering them literally, at least one of them will typically be a reference to another property. But before we look at an example of that, let's consider these other two arguments. So the first argument is an expression that evaluates to true or false, and then the second argument is going to be the value to return if that first argument is true. And so the third argument is going to be the value to return if that first argument evaluates to false. So basically, you can read an if function like this: if argument 1 is true, return argument 2. Otherwise, return argument 3. So let's just look at our example here and make it a really simple full if function. So if 2 is greater than 3, we'll return, the text string yes. And then for the third argument, we'll say no. So what we have written here is if 2 is greater than 3, return yes. Otherwise, return no. So if we look at the output, we see that the output is no because 2 is not greater than 3. This is false. So if we look at kind of a real practical example here, we have a set of exam grades. And you can see that we have a number property that is the score of each student's exam. So we just want the status to output either pass or fail for each of these exams. So what we can do here, and this is when we'll start referencing another property, what we want to ask is if the score is greater than or equal to 70%, then we want it to pass. Otherwise, we want it to fail. So what we'll do here is we'll type our if keyword, and we're going to reference the score property. So we use our prop keyword and then the name of the property within quotation marks. It's a text string. So if the score is greater than or equal to 70%, which as a decimal is 0.7, then we want to return pass. If not, this is our third argument of our if function, we want to return fail. And then we can close our if function with that closing parenthesis. So we can see here that we have 3 passes and a fail. The only exam that scored below a 70% is a fail. So if we change this score, Tom Brady's score, to a 68, then our status automatically changes to fail. So you can see here that this is just a simple example of a if this, then that, which is what our if function does. So let's move on to our real practical examples. And remember that these examples I've made available as a free template at Notion Market. So you'll have the formulas and you'll see exactly how they work if you access them there. So in most cases, really, you're not going to want just this or that, but you're going to want a variety of conditions. And the way that you can create more than 2 conditions is by nesting if functions. And what I mean by that is that you have an outer if function, but for either the second argument and or the third argument, you can use another if function. So it's kind of creating additional branches of this trail. And so we'll see exactly what I mean by that. We still have this exam grades database. This is another view of it. And we have our status of pass or fail, but now we want to assign a letter grade to each of these scores. And of course, there's more than 2 letter grades. So if the score is greater than or equal to 90%, we want it to be an A. If it's greater than or equal to 80%, we want it to be a B, and so forth. So I'm going to resort this into descending values here so that we can have an easier look at it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type this formula in this code block. It's just a Notion code block, and it's going to make it easier to see exactly how it's structured. So we'll start with an opening if function, and then I'm going to do a line break and a couple of spaces to indent to illustrate where we're inputting the arguments. So the first argument, what we want to do is we want to test, is the score greater than or equal to 90%? So we're going to reference the score property, and we're going to ask, is it greater than or equal to 90%, which is represented as this decimal here. So the second argument is going to be what to return if it is greater than or equal to 90%, in which case we want to return an A. But now, if it's not an A, we want to ask if it's greater than or equal to 80%. So we're going to create another if function. This is our nested if function. And so then we're going to have the first argument of this nested if function, which is going to test whether score is greater than or equal to 80%. And I'm going to copy this value here because we're going to reuse this a few times. So if it is greater than or equal to 80%, we want to return a B. And then we're on to our third argument of our nested if, in which case we want to test if the score is greater than or equal to 70%. So I'm just going to paste that little sequence of characters there that I copied and just change the 8 to a 7. But you know what? This is actually going to be another nested if. So this is actually going to be another opening if, and then within that, I'm going to paste this next iteration of the first argument. And then if it is greater than or equal to 70%, we're going to return a C. And then we're going to have one more nested if. And so we're going to open up our if here as the third argument, have another series of indentations, and change this 8 now to a 6 to test whether or not it's greater than or equal to 60%, in which case we want to return a D. And now we don't need any additional nested ifs. We're at the end of the kind of branches in our trail. We know if it's not an A, B, C, or D, then it is a failing F. So then we can just close out each version of our ifs, each nested if, until we close out our last one. Now, when you use this code block here with all these line breaks and spaces, Notion's formula property is not going to accept it with all of those extra characters. So you can copy the contents of the code block, paste it into the address bar of your browser, and then copy it again. That eliminates all those line breaks, at which point you can paste it right into your formula property in Notion. So here you can see that our letter grades correspond appropriately to the scores. If we change a score, we'll change Tom Brady's again to a 68, then it becomes a D. So our grade, our letter grade, is then dynamic. We have these various conditions, more than just 2 conditions that we can assign for the various test scores. So let's move on to our next example, which is the automation of a project's status. So for dashboards and filtered database views, it's helpful to assign a status to projects such as planned or in progress or complete. And with the if function, you can automate that status property based on a progress property. And you may or may not have seen that, but with relation and rollup properties, you have the ability to automatically calculate the progress of a project based on the number of that project's tasks that have been completed as indicated by checkbox. So let me show you what I mean by that. Here we have a projects database and a tasks database, and each task is related to one of these projects. Of course, that's done using this relation property. And so with that relation established, we can use this rollup property here to pull in the complete property for each of the related tasks. So when we configure our rollup, we can see that we've chosen the tasks as the relation. And then for the related items, we want to pull in the complete property. It's that checkbox property. And then we have the option, because that's a checkbox property, we can automatically calculate the percentage of checked tasks. And so that gives us the progress of each project. So if we mess around with the checkboxes here, you can see that the progress changes. So knowing the progress, we can use a formula then to automatically return the status of the project. If the project is at 0%, then it's a planned project. If it's at 100%, it's a complete project, and anything else is going to be in progress. So this is just going to be a simple series of if functions with just one nested if. So we'll start our if, and we want to test whether the progress property is 0. So we'll say prop progress. And then to test whether it equals 0, we'll use that equals operator, which is the double equal sign, and we'll say 0. So if progress equals 0, that's our first argument, we want to return planned. And then for the third argument, we want just one nested if. So we know that it's not 0. We want to test if progress equals 1, which is 100%, then we want to return complete. And then so this third argument of the nested if function is going to be if the progress is not 0 and not 1, in which case it's in progress. Then we can close out both of our ifs. We can paste this into the address bar, copy it again, and then paste it into our status. And you can see here that the status is automatically generated according to the progress of the project, which of course is automatically calculated based on the number of checkbox that are checked. So let's move on to our last example, which is the automatic prioritization of tasks. And to do this, we are going to use the Eisenhower matrix. So if you haven't seen the Eisenhower matrix before, what you do with it is for each task, you assign it a level of importance and a level of urgency. So every task can either be important or not important, and urgent or not urgent. And then if a task is important and urgent, it gives you the action of doing that task. If it's important but not urgent, then you schedule the task. If it's not important but urgent, you delegate it. And then if it's not important and also not urgent, then you eliminate the task. So with the Notion database, you can facilitate that process. Here in our database of tasks, we have two select properties, one for importance and the other for urgency. So for importance, you can choose either important or not important. For urgency, you can choose either urgent or not urgent. And with a formula property, we can automatically generate the action to take. And you can do that by using a series of if functions. So let's write that series of if functions. We want to start off by testing if the importance property is equal to important. And then we're on to the second argument. So we know that importance is important. Now we want to know, is urgency urgent? So we're going to use a nested if. And this is the first time we've used a nested if as the second argument. So now we want to test, is urgency equal to urgent? And so the second argument of this nested if is the value to return if we have important and urgent, in which case we want to do the task. And then the third argument of the nested if is going to be where importance is important, but urgency is not urgent, in which case we want to schedule the task. So we can close out that nested if, and that closes out the second argument of our outer if. And now we're on to the third argument of our outer if, which means the value to return if importance is not important. So once again, we want to test if urgency is urgent. Now, the second argument of this second nested if function is going to be where importance is not important, but urgency is urgent, which means we want to delegate. And then the third argument of this second nested if is going to be where a task is neither important nor urgent, in which case we want to eliminate it. So that we can close our second nested if, close out our outer if, copy the contents of this, recopy it from our address bar, and then paste it into the priority property. And here you can see that our priority now corresponds with each importance and urgency combination. So if we change importance and urgency, then the value of the priority property is going to change automatically as well. Now, you probably also want to sort by the priority property too. If you just do it alphabetically, then you're not going to get the sorting order that you want. The do's are going to be most important, and then of course the eliminates are going to be the least important. So what we can do here is another series of if functions, and I might already have this. Yeah, a priority order property. So I'll wipe out what's already in place here. We have just a blank formula property here for the priority order. And so basically we just want to assign a number to each of these priority possibilities. So again, that's just going to be another series of ifs. So in our first argument, we want to test whether priority is equal to do, in which case we want to return the number 1. And then if it's not due, we want our third argument to be another test if the priority property is equal to schedule. Then we'll return a 2. And if it's not 1 or 2, then we want to test whether it is equal to delegate. In which case we want to return a 3. And then if we know if it's not due, schedule, delegate, then it's automatically going to be eliminate, in which case we want to return a 4. And then we can close out each of our ifs, do our little copy and paste sequence here. And we can see that the dues are 1, the schedules are 2, the delegates are 3, and the eliminates are 4. And this database is already sorted by priority order. So with this exercise, you have the ability to assign an importance and an urgency to each task. An action is going to be automatically generated through this formula that uses if functions. And then we're also going to use if functions to assign a number to represent the priority of each action. So this is 3 real-life practical examples of the if function. If you get the hang of these specific examples, even if you're not using these particular types of databases in your workspace, if you just grasp the concepts, you're going to be able to apply them to a variety of other use cases. As I said, the if function is widely used and widely versatile, and it applies to tools beyond Notion too. So it's a really good skill to have. So work with these examples, master them, and then try to apply the concepts to your own uses. And if you encounter any obstacles along the way, please feel free to find me on Twitter at William Nutt. I love answering questions there. And at this point, I will answer any questions that may have emerged in the Ask a Question tool in here in Crowdcast. If I can figure out how to make the screens the same size. So we have two Ask a Questions, and they're both from Danny, our most active participant, as always. Thank you, Danny. Do you use the short form of if using question mark and colon rather than if? So what you're referring to there, Danny, is the and I may butcher the name, but it's the tertiary operator or something close to that. And that's kind of a shortcut to creating multiple conditions. And Danny, that's getting into what might be another level of this little mini series here of formulas. This is really more about mastering the if function specifically, and the fundamentals of it before we elevate the exercise. But that's definitely something we'll get into in another time. Great question though. And then another question here. Do you always create a formula in a code block, or do you make it in the formula box? So it depends on the complexity of the formula. And if we're doing a lot of nested ifs, and I really need to see the different kind of levels of that nesting hierarchy, then it's much easier to construct and visualize within that code block and then copy it and paste it into the formula box, because the formula box is not going to allow you to create those line breaks where you're entering kind of a different level of the hierarchy. So it's a really helpful practice, particularly as you're kind of getting the hang of this. So I would definitely, at least as you practice, use those code blocks. And then once you're more comfortable without the line breaks, you can just kind of skip that step. And I started there for a second because I saw that we have Natasha in the chat, and I sent an email to Natasha this morning. So that's fun. Just another example of how we have such a strong Notion community. So thank you, Danny, for those great questions. Any other questions about the if function or anything else that may be on your mind about Notion? Any issues that you've encountered recently? If you're going to ask me when the API is going to be released, I'm just going to tell you it's around the corner, as you've been hearing for quite a while, but we have more and more evidence of it being coming soon. Yeah, and we already have a participant in the Ask a Question box addressing that API. Okay, well, again, you have these examples available for free download at market.notion.vip. Tim asks, is there a limit to how many ifs can be nested? So I don't know the answer to that. I've used a pretty deep level of ifs, of nested ifs, and never encountered an issue. So I don't anticipate that you'll find yourself in a circumstance where you've reached a prohibitive limit. But if you do in a practical use case, or if you just want to test it, Tim, I'd love for you to tweet at me and let me know what you find, because that could be kind of a fun exercise there. So let's continue the conversation on Twitter and elsewhere. And hopefully you'll find a variety of helpful applications for this widely versatile if function. And until the next time, I'll see you on the web. Thank you all so much.